Richard Angelo, Angel of Death. While working at the Good Samaritan Medical Center in West Islip, New York for 7 months, Richard Angelo poisoned at least 35 people. The poisoning resulted in 10 deaths. He claimed that his motive was to portray himself as a hero. After poisoning the patients, he would wait until they went into cardiac arrest and then come by and save them in front of his colleagues. Angelo was caught after one of the patients felt unwell after the injection, and paged a nurse for help. Angelo was arrested for assault on the 73-year-old patient because he was the only person to match the description given to the police. Following his arrest, Angelo confessed to having poisoned many other patients. As a result, as many as 30 recently deceased patients were exhumed for examination. Angelo was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He will become eligible for parole in 2049, when he is 87. Trevor Joseph Hardy, the Beast of Manchester. Trevor Hardy spent 5 months in jail for battering a man with a pickaxe. After being released, he went on to murder 3 teenage girls in the Manchester area between December 1974 and March 1976. The first of which, he stabbed in the throat and buried in a nearby clay pit. For weeks afterwards he kept returning to the makeshift grave at night to cut up the body and bury the parts in other places. Hardy went to extraordinary lengths to evade capture, going so far as to use a nail file on his own teeth, in an attempt to avoid being linked to teeth marks found on the bodies. Hardy was found guilty on 3 charges of murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. He had spent 35 years in prison and was one of the longest-serving prisoners in England and Wales. Hardy collapsed in his cell in 2012 after suffering a heart attack. He died in the hospital 2 days later, aged 67. Arthur John Shawcross, Genesee River. Shawcross raped and killed 10-year-old Jake Blake and 8-year-old Karen Hill in Watertown, New York in 1972. He was arrested and allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of first-degree manslaughter for both deaths. Shawcross was sentenced to an indeterminate term with a maximum of 25 years. He was paroled in 1987. Shawcross began his crimes in Rochester in 1988, mostly strangulation, and many of his targets were not just slain but mutilated and cannibalized. He sometimes ate the female's genitals. He was apprehended after a witness saw him urinating off of a bridge near where he had dumped one of the bodies. Defense attorneys tried to argue that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. Shawcross was found guilty and sentenced to 250 years. He died in prison in 2008 at the age of 63. Schaefer, killer cop. Gerard John Schaefer used his position as a police officer to abduct, assault and murder at least 2 women during the early 70s. It is suspected that he may have been responsible for dozens more. Schaefer was also dubbed the Florida sex beast by reporters, perhaps because of the nature of his crimes. He eventually was revealed to have had a long sadomasochistic streak. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Schaefer also claimed in interviews to have taken many more lives over the years than just the 2 for which he was convicted. In 1995, Schaefer was stabbed to death on the floor of his cell by a fellow inmate. He had been stabbed over 40 times about the face, head, neck and body, with his throat also being slashed, his right eye destroyed, and several ribs fractured. The stabbing occurred following an argument over who received the final cup of hot water from a dispenser, days prior to his murder. Gary Michael Heidnik, inspired, Buffalo Bill. Heidnik is an American murderer and serial apist who kidnapped and tortured 6 women, murdering 2 of them, while holding them captive in a self-dug pit in his basement, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 1 victim died of a combination of starvation, torture, and an untreated fever. He cooked her ribs in an oven and boiled her head in a pot. Another victim was electrocuted to death. In May 2018, a special report titled, Gary Heidnik's House of Horrors, 30 Years Later, was aired, and featured an interview in which one victim recounted that Heidnik wrapped duct tape around the mouths of the women, and stabbed them in their ears with a screwdriver. Heidnik was sentenced to death and in 1999 he was executed by lethal injection. Heidnik was one of the inspirations for the James, Buffalo Bill, Gum character in The Silence of the Lambs. Haj Muhammad Mesfui, the man who was walled. Mesfui worked as a shoemaker in Marrakesh, Morocco. He was assisted by a woman named Anna, 70 years old. Mesfui would take the lives of young women who came to his shop. He would incapacitate them using drugs before decapitating them with a dagger. Authorities found the remains of 20 mutilated bodies in a deep pit under the shop, while another 16 were discovered in his garden. He was caught after the family of a young victim traced her movements back to his shop. The family tortured Anna to death during questioning. Mesfui confessed that he took the lives of the women so he could take their small amounts of money. Mesfui was initially sentenced to be crucified, but due to the heinous nature of his crimes and to serve as a warning to others, Mesfui was walled up alive in the Marrakesh marketplace bazaar. After his entombment, the crowd would be silent, but then cheer every time they heard him scream inside. He went silent on the third day. June 13, 1906. Joseph Nasso, Crazy Joe. Nasso was a former photographer convicted of murdering 4 young California women decades ago. Prosecutors called him a remorseless serial killer who preyed on young prostitutes. Nevada authorities arrested Nasso in April 2010. While searching his home, they discovered a handwritten diary in which Nasso listed 10 unnamed women with geographical locations. The diary excerpts showed how Nasso stalked and assaulted his victims and then photographed them in sexual poses alongside mannequin parts. In entry after entry, Nasso wrote how he would stalk and approach a woman, offer her a ride home and then put it to her, often in his car. His descriptions of rapes and sexual assaults in the journal as far back as the 1950s. In 2013, Nasso was convicted of the murders by a Marin County jury and a Marin County judge sentenced him to death. Despite the death sentence, 89-year-old Nasso is unlikely to see the state's death chamber. Joe Matheny, the cannibal. American serial killer and rapist, Joe Matheny murdered at least 10 people. He claims it was more. The killings involved brutal sexual assaults and many victims were dismembered. Matheny gained the nickname, the Cannibal, because he claimed that he had cooked and eaten flesh from his victims. At one point, he stated that he mixed their flesh in with pork and beef he sold at his roadside barbecue stand. He was arrested on December 15, 1996, 7 days after a woman escaped his trailer where he attempted to kill her. While there was only enough evidence to convict him of 2 murders, more victims were confirmed, but he was never charged. He was sentenced to death, which was later reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in prison on August 4, 2017. Tony Costa, the Cape Cod vampire. Tony Costa was a Cape Cod, Massachusetts carpenter who achieved notoriety for committing at least 4 murders in 1969. He was suspected of up to 8. The district attorney, Edmund Dinnis, gave the media details saying, "The hearts of each girl had been removed from the bodies and were not in the graves. Each body was cut into as many parts as there are joints." Dinnis also claimed that there were teeth marks found on the bodies. Most of Dinnis' comments were untrue. The hearts had not been removed, although some organs were missing from at least one of the bodies. The victims knew Costa, and he murdered them while spending time and getting high with the women. In May 1970, Costa was convicted of 4 murders and sentenced to life in prison. On May 12, 1974, 4 years after his incarceration, Costa was found hanging in his prison cell with a leather belt around his neck. His death was ruled a suicide. He was 29 years old. Martha Wise, Borgia of America. Wise was an American poisoner and serial killer. She was known to be obsessed with funerals. She seldom missed a visit to any funeral held in or near Hardscrabble, whether she had known the deceased or not. When her husband Albert died suddenly in 1922, Martha's odd behavior and fixation on funerals became more noticeable, and she began not only attending funerals, but openly crying and lamenting at them, no matter who had died. After her husband died, and her family forced her to end a relationship with a new lover, Wise retaliated by poisoning 17 family members with arsenic. 3 of them died, including her own mother. She was convicted of only one of the murders. The judge sentenced Martha to a life imprisonment, under the terms of which she could only be freed by executive clemency. Despite being paroled at age 79, she returned to prison because she had nowhere else to go. Martha died in prison in 1971. Thazamil Taki, the sugarcane killer. Taki is a South African serial killer who killed 13 women aged 18 to 25. Dumping their bodies in sugar cane plantations. Robbery was his sole motivation. The victims all happened to be searching for work at the time of their murders. Taki, pretending to be a job recruiter, would lure his victims with the promise of work. Before the women were murdered and abandoned in the sugar cane fields, they had been stripped of their clothing and robbed of their cash and cell phones. After tracing one of the victim's cell phones, they searched Taki's house and found cell phones and clothing belonging to many of the other victims. In January 2011, Taki was sentenced to 13 life sentences for the murders and an additional 208 years, 16 years for each of his victims of armed robbery. Leonarda Cianciulli, witch of Correggio. Leonarda Cianciulli was an Italian serial killer. She murdered 3 women in 1939 and 1940, and turned their bodies into soap, using caustic soda, and tea cakes. Learning that her eldest son, and favorite child, Giuseppe, was going to join the army in preparation for the Second World War was what set her off. She was determined to protect him, and came to the conclusion that she could keep him safe by sacrificing other humans. She killed and dismembered 3 of her neighbors. She stated, "I made lots of crunchy tea cakes and served them to the ladies who came to visit, though Giuseppe and I also ate them." Cianciulli was found guilty of her crimes and sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. She died of cerebral apoplexy in the Women's Criminal Asylum in October of 1970. Takahiro Shiraishi, the Twitter killer. Takahiro Shiraishi is a Japanese serial killer and rapist. In Japan, between August and October 2017, he murdered 9 people, mostly young women including 3 high school girls. He became known as the Twitter killer, because he reportedly stalked Twitter and contacted suicidal people asking them to come to his house so he could watch them commit suicide. He offered to either assist, or watch them kill themselves. Shiraishi confessed to killing and dismembering the 9 people. He stored their bodies in cooler boxes and large storage boxes in his apartment. Shiraishi claimed his motive was sex. He wanted to use his victims' vulnerable states to manipulate and sexually assault them, fulfilling his fantasies without having to worry about them denying his advances. Shiraishi's death sentence was finalized in January 2021, and he is currently awaiting execution. Michael Wayne McGray, the homicidal slasher. McGray is a Canadian serial killer who has brutally murdered at least 7 people from 1985 to 1998 and claims to have killed 16. McGray has offered to release the details of 16 murders he claims to have committed over the years in exchange for immunity for his accomplices, immunity for himself against the new charges, and psychiatric treatment for what he calls his demons. Although they found his claims credible, Halifax authorities said, "No deal" to the request. McGray claims that these demons caused his 15-year killing spree and has stated that he will murder guards, prisoners, or anybody else to quench his searing hunger to kill. McGray is serving concurrent life sentences of 25 years with no parole. Documents released in 2019 reveal that McGray told a fellow inmate that he was responsible for a killing with chilling similarities to a case that kept a wrongfully convicted man, Glenn Assoon, imprisoned for nearly 17 years. Harold Sasek, the Gasman. Sasek was an Austrian serial killer who committed, amongst other crimes, 6 murders and 9 robberies. Surviving victims said that a chubby, nice man had asked them to let him in by saying, "The Gasman is here." He was always well dressed, and had a seemingly valid identity card and expertise. After speaking with his victims and getting them to reveal where their money was hidden, he would strike them down and rob them. Sasek served a life sentence in prison. Spending over 39 years behind bars, he was the longest-serving of Austrian imprisoned convicts. Sasek died in August of 2013, shortly after being released. He died from a prolonged illness at a Lower Austrian nursing home. His exact date of birth is unknown. He was born in 1948, making him 64 or 65 years old at the time of his death. Derek Todd Lee, the Baton Rouge serial killer. Between 1992 and 2003, Lee murdered 7 women in the Baton Rouge area. Prior to his murder charges, Lee had been arrested for stalking women and watching them in their homes. Despite this, he was initially overlooked by police, because they incorrectly believed the killer was white. Lee was linked by DNA to the deaths of 7 women in the Baton Rouge and Lafayette areas in Louisiana. In 2004 he was convicted, in separate trials, of the murders of Geraldine DeSoto and Charlotte Murray Pace. The Pace trial resulted in a death sentence. Newspapers suggested Lee was responsible for other unsolved murders in the area, but the police lacked DNA evidence. After Lee's arrest, it was discovered that another serial killer, Sean Vincent Gillis, was operating in the Baton Rouge area during the same time as Lee. Lee died in 2016, of heart disease at a hospital in Louisiana, where he was transported for treatment from Louisiana State Penitentiary, in which he had been awaiting execution. Torrey's Park and the Rainbow Maniac. The Patorrey's Park murders are a series of 13 murders of gay men, committed between February 2007 and August 2008, in Patorres Park in Carapicuíba, Brazil. All perpetrated by an unidentified serial killer who has been dubbed the «Rainbow Maniac», a reference to the gay pride flag. The victims were aged 20 to 40. All but one were shot, 12 of them in the head. One died from blows to the head. The last victim was shot 12 times. In 2008, police arrested a retired state police sergeant, Jairo Francisco Franco, based on witness statements implicating him in a murder which occurred on 19 August 2008. A witness claims to have seen Franco shoot a black gay man 12 times that night. Another witness told police that Franco often visited the park. Franco was declared not guilty by the jury, 4 votes against 2, and Franco was allowed to walk free in August of 2011. Since no other suspects have been arrested, a serial killer is running free, for now. Jean-Baptiste Tropman, the human tiger, French killer who murdered 8 members of the Kink family, including 6 children aged between 2 and 16 years old, in 1869. Tropman fed his partner, Kink, a lethal dose of prussic acid mixed in wine in order to steal his money. Once he was dead, Tropman wired to Mrs. Kink asking her for money. He said it was for Mr. Kink. She sent her son with a check. When he was unable to cash it, he hacked her son into pieces. Tropman then arranged a meeting with Mrs. Kink in Paris. She gave him 55,000 francs thinking that they were for her husband. Once Tropman had the money, he butchered Mrs. Kink and her remaining 5 children in a remote spot near the Pantin Common. The next day the bloodbath was uncovered by a workman who uncovered the mutilated remains of Hortense Kink and her children. More charges were added against Tropman once the bodies of Gustave and Jean Kink were unearthed. Tropman was sentenced to death for the 8 killings and, on January 19, 1870 he was guillotined. Sarah Maria Aldrete, the godmother. Convicted Mexican serial killer, Aldrete, headed a drug smuggling and human sacrifice cult with Adolfo Constanzo. The members of the cult called her the godmother, La Madrina. The cult was involved in multiple ritualistic killings. The pair moved to Rancho Santa Elena, a house in the desert where they could carry out more sadistic ritual murders, sometimes of strangers and other times of rival drug dealers. While investigating the disappearance of a local college student, Mark Kilroy, detectives discovered a shrine with human hair, brains, teeth, and skulls at the ranch. Upon further investigation, they dug up 15 mutilated corpses. Aldrete was convicted of several of the killings at the cult's headquarters, and sentenced to 30 years in prison. If Aldrete is ever released from prison, American authorities plan to prosecute her for the murder of Mark Kilroy. Alfredo Galán Sotillo, the playing card killer. Galán killed 6 people and wounded 3 others in Madrid from January to March of 2003. The attacks seemed to be unrelated at first, then the killer started leaving calling cards at each scene. He left a playing card from a deck of Spanish barajas. It was not originally his intention for playing cards to be his signature. He only began leaving cards after the media sensationalized the fact that a card had been found by a victim's body. On 3 July 2003, Galán surrendered at a police station and confessed to being the playing card killer. He had smuggled the gun into Spain by hiding it in a television set. He was sentenced to 142 years and 3 months in prison. Most of his sentences will run concurrently, as the maximum jail term under Spanish law is 20 years for non-terrorism cases. This means he may be released soon. Hamilton Howard, Albert, Fish, the Boogeyman. American serial killer, rapist, child molester, and cannibal who committed at least 3 child murders from July 1924 to June 1928. He was also known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, and the Boogeyman. Fish was a suspect in at least 5 murders during his lifetime. He confessed to 3 murders that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Fish once boasted that he had children in every state, and at one time stated his number of victims was about 100. However, it is not known whether he was referring to rapes or cannibalization, nor is it known if the statement was truthful. Fish was apprehended in December of 1934, and put on trial for the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd. He was convicted and executed by electric chair in 1936, at the age of 65. Donald Henry Gaskins, Jr., the meanest man in America. Gaskins was a serial killer and rapist from South Carolina who stabbed, shot, drowned, and poisoned more than a dozen people. He had a long history of criminal activities resulting in prison sentences for assault, burglary, and statutory rape. His last arrest was for contributing to the delinquency of a minor, 13-year-old Kim Gelkin. who had gone missing in September 1975. During their search for the missing girl, police discovered 8 bodies near Gaskins's home. In 1976, a jury found Gaskins guilty of murder and sentenced him to death. The death sentence was overturned by the Supreme Court in 1978, and rather than face a new trial, Gaskins pled guilty to the murders of 9 people. He was given 10 concurrent life sentences. While imprisoned, Gaskins brutally murdered a fellow inmate. He received a second death sentence. Just before his execution, Gaskins said he killed 110 people, but he was only confirmed to have killed 13 people between 1970 and 1975. John Reginald Christie, Monster of Rillington Place. Christie was an English serial killer and alleged necrophile in the 1940s and early 1950s. Christie murdered at least 8 people by strangling them at his flat in London. In 1949, Christie strangled his pregnant neighbour, Beryl Evans, and her baby daughter Geraldine. Providing evidence as the key witness, Christie ultimately framed Beryl's husband, Timothy. The jury found Timothy guilty despite Christie's criminal record of theft and violence. Timothy was unjustly hanged in 1950. Christie subsequently strangled 4 more women, including his wife. Several police searches of the property showed a complete lack of expertise in handling forensic evidence. If searches had been conducted properly, the investigation would have exposed Christie, and the lives of Evans and 4 women would have been saved. Christie was hanged in 1953 at HM Prison Pentonville. Ivan Jerome Hill, the 60 freeway killer. Hill was responsible for at least 9 murders in different suburbs of Los Angeles from 1986 to 1994, dumping the bodies along the East-West Highway, California State Route 60. He also committed at least one of the Southside Slayer murders in South LA. It's suspected that he has been involved in more. As a minor, Hill was found guilty of complicity in murder, but received a short sentence for cooperating. He was paroled and released in the mid-1980s. In 1993 he was caught committing several robberies and sentenced to 10 years. While serving this second sentence, a blood sample was taken from Hill. His DNA test matched that of an unidentified serial killer, who had left DNA evidence during attacks on women all over LA County dating back to 1986. In 2006, Hill was convicted on 6 counts of murder. As of July 2023, 62-year-old Hill is still alive, awaiting execution on San Quentin State Prison's death row. Mary Flora Bell, 10-year-old monster. Mary Flora Bell is an English woman who, as a child, strangled and killed 2 preschool-age boys in 1968. Mary committed her first killing when she was just 10 years old. In both instances, Mary informed her victim he had a sore throat, which she would massage before proceeding to strangle him. Mary was convicted of manslaughter for both killings, which were determined to have been committed under diminished responsibility. Her accomplice in at least one of the killings, 13-year-old Norma Bell, no relation, was acquitted of all charges. Mary is Britain's youngest female killer and was diagnosed with a psychopathic personality disorder prior to her trial. Mary was released from custody in 1980, at the age of 23. A lifelong court order granted her anonymity, which has since been extended to protect the identity of her daughter and granddaughter. She has since lived under a series of pseudonyms. Paul Michael Stephanie, the weepy-voiced killer.
I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I let this happen. I'm so upset about it.
Stephanie attacked 5 women, killing 3 of them, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area during the early 80s. His nickname came from the fact that he called 911 after each attack. He confessed his crimes in a remorseful and high-pitched voice to police, tearfully pleading that they make him stop. He was captured in 1982, after a woman he had attacked was able to escape. She hit him on the head with a glass bottle after he had stabbed her 15 times. He called for medical help. This call confirmed Stephanie was the weepy-voiced killer, and linked him to this earlier attack. While he was serving a 40-year sentence, he asked to speak to police. Having learned that he was terminally ill, he confessed to 2 more killings and another attack. The crimes had gone unsolved for 15 years. Stephanie died of complications from skin cancer while incarcerated at the age of 53. Coral Eugene Watts, Sunday morning slasher. Watts murdered numerous women and girls over an 8-year period in several different jurisdictions and states. When he was caught, prosecutors in Texas didn't know if they had enough evidence to find Watts guilty of murder. They brokered a deal and granted Watts immunity for a dozen murders. He was sentenced to 60 years. A Texas Court of Appeals eventually reclassified him as a nonviolent felon, due to a technicality making him eligible for early release. The Attorney General in Michigan went on national TV urging anyone to come forward with information, in order to convict Watts of murder, to ensure he was not released. Info linking him to other murders in Michigan, where he didn't have immunity, was brought forward. Watts was convicted in the deaths of 2 Michigan women. Out of the possible 100-plus women he is believed to have killed between 1974 and 1982. Suspected of being the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, Watts died of prostate cancer in 2007 while serving 2 life sentences without parole. Shelley Andre Brooks, Detroit and Highland Park, Michigan. Brooks killed at least 7 women between 2001 and 2006. He targeted middle-aged female prostitutes or homeless drug addicts as his victims. He committed his crimes around Detroit City, leaving the bodies in abandoned buildings and houses. He easily gained his victims' trust because of his own life on the streets. Brooks would take his victims to abandoned buildings and houses, where he sexually assaulted them and beat them to death with rocks. He left the bodies in the same abandoned buildings he lured them into. In 2006, Brooks was arrested for sexually assaulting a woman. After his arrest, his DNA was transferred into a database in an effort to possibly connect him to any unsolved cold cases. Authorities had their first hit after they successfully linked him to the 2002 slaying of Pamela Greer. Further research confirmed his involvement in the other 6 murders. He was convicted of 2 murders, though he was suspected of up to 13 and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Robert Joseph Silveria, Jr., the Boxcar Killer. For 15 years Robert Silveria rode the rails, killing fellow freight train riders throughout the U.S. A police detective and prosecutor in Salem, Oregon, unraveled the truth of Silveria's killing spree, which began with a murder in Salem. By the end of the investigation, Silveria had been linked to 13 other boxcar murders in Oregon, Utah, California, Arizona, Kansas and Washington state spanning from 1981 to 1995. Silveria confessed to murdering 28 people, also known as Sidetrack Bob, and a member of the Freight Train Riders of America, a criminal underworld brotherhood. Silveria was arrested in Auburn, California in March 1996. His victims, mostly drifters, were stabbed or bludgeoned to death and robbed of their meager possessions. While in custody he claimed all his kills were gang-related hits. Silveria was convicted and is currently imprisoned in Wyoming. He is serving double life sentences. Earl Nelson, the Dark Strangler. Earl Nelson was America's worst murderer long before the term serial killer was even invented. Most of his victims were raped, strangled and their bodies hidden somewhere on his property. He also raped many of the women after killing them. At first, Nelson admitted to his crimes, bluntly telling reporters, "I only do my lady killings on Saturday nights." However, he would subsequently retract his admission and claim he was innocent. At the peak of his killing spree, Nelson was killing once every 3 weeks on average. His killings sometimes occurred in spurts. His last victim had been his 5th victim in only 10 days. Though Nelson refused to admit to any of the crimes, he had been linked to a total of 22 murders that occurred between 1926 and 1927. His victims consisted almost exclusively of women, along with 1 male infant child. A jury found him guilty of murder and he received a mandatory death sentence. Nelson was executed by hanging in January of 1928. Robert Berdella, the Butcher of Kansas. American serial killer who kidnapped, brutally raped, tortured and ultimately dismembered 6 young men in his unassuming home on a quiet street in Kansas City. First, he would force his victims to endure periods of up to 6 weeks of captivity where he would brutally sodomize and sexually assault them, perform barbaric experiments such as electroshocks to the eyeballs and injecting drain cleaner into the larynx in an attempt to render them mute. Police secured a search warrant for Berdella's house after a young man escaped, by leaping from a second-story window of the house, wearing nothing but a dog collar around his neck. Upon searching the property, police discovered human remains, a stack of Polaroid photos of his victims during and after their murders, and the instruments used. Police also found a stenographer's pad meticulously detailing the crimes. Berdella was arrested and charged with the murders. He accepted a deal where he pleaded guilty and revealed everything about the murders in exchange for a life sentence without parole, to avoid the death penalty. He died in prison in 1992. Randy Kraft, the Scorecard Killer. Kraft was a dull, plain-looking computer consultant with an IQ of 129. Between 1972 and 1983, he would pick up hitchhikers and offer them beer he had drugged, so that he could torture, sexually abuse and kill them. He would then dump their bodies onto freeway ramps. He was caught when he was stopped by highway patrol officers on a freeway in 1983. Inside his vehicle was a victim that he had strangled. Upon his arrest, investigators found a coded list with 61 entries on a scorecard containing cryptic references to his victims. At his home, they further discovered snapshots that he had taken of them, as well as a collection of their possessions. A jury convicted Kraft of 16 murders. After prosecutors introduced evidence that his total victims numbered 65 or more, he was sentenced to death. Decades later, Kraft is still on death row as his case makes its way through the appeals process. Charles Jackson, Jr., the East Bay Slayer. Jackson was responsible for the murders of at least 7 women and 1 man, between 1975 and 1982 in the San Francisco Bay Area. More of his victims were discovered a few years after his death, based on results from DNA profiling. Jackson was apprehended after he raped, strangled, and stabbed 44-year-old Joan Stewart. The morning after the murder, her body was found with a half-eaten piece of Canadian bacon on it. Odd, because she was a vegetarian. Investigators came to the conclusion that the killer was eating the bacon during the attack and must have accidentally dropped it. Eyewitnesses reported a suspicious vehicle driving erratically, and wrote down the license plate on the car. Police questioned its owner, Charles Jackson, Jr., and then went to Jackson's home, whom he shared with his mother. Jackson's mother told them that every morning she wraps a piece of Canadian bacon to give to him before he goes off to work. Jackson was charged with murder, found guilty and received a life sentence. Jackson died in prison in 2002. Anthony McKnight, East Bay serial killer. McKnight attacked 10 women in Oakland, California, killing 5 of them between September 1985 and January 1986. McKnight was known as a lively and friendly man. He was popular in the area and many of his friends described him as very positive. They were completely unaware that he was a sex offender. In 1987, McKnight was found guilty of several cases of kidnapping, assault, rape and attempted murder, receiving 63 years imprisonment. 12 years into his sentence, investigators suspected McKnight may have committed unsolved murders. They got permission to take a DNA sample from McKnight and enter it into California's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. McKnight was connected to 5 rape murders. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. In 2019, after having spent more than 33 years behind bars, and 11 years on death row, McKnight died at the age of 65 from unspecified causes. Luis Garavito, the Beast. Luis Garavito confessed to committing rape, torture, mutilation and murder of at least 193 boys and teenagers in the 1990s. The murders took place in Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. The victims were mostly those experiencing homelessness or came from impoverished neighborhoods. Despite his confession, which already makes him an incredibly prolific murderer, he suspected of killing more than 300 children. Garavito was charged with a 40-year sentence, the maximum allowed by Colombian law at the time. But this was later reduced to 22 years for helping the police find some of the victims' bodies. Despite being considered one of the worst serial killers in modern history, he will be eligible for parole this year, 2023. Kenneth Allen McDuff, the Broomstick Killer. McDuff was an American serial killer responsible for murdering at least 9 people. In 1966 he was convicted of murdering 16-year-old Edna Sullivan along with her boyfriend, 17-year-old Robert Brand, and his cousin, 15-year-old Mark Dunham. They were all strangers whom McDuff abducted after noticing Sullivan. McDuff repeatedly raped her before killing her by breaking her neck with a broomstick. McDuff was given 3 death sentences which were reduced to life imprisonment due to the 1972 Supreme Court ruling Furman v. Georgia. He was paroled in 1989 and went on to kill at least 6 more women. He was finally executed in 1999, and is suspected to have had many other victims. Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Rodney Alcala is also called the dating game killer, because of his appearance on a famous TV show with a similar name. Alcala won the competition and a date with the episode's Bachelorette. However, she refused the date because she found him creepy. Alcala's first assault was on an 8-year-old girl in 1968. Witnesses saw Alcala lure the girl into his apartment. When the police arrived, the girl was found alive, having been raped and beaten. Alcala fled and went on the run. He was eventually caught several times for other rapes and molestations, leading to a few short-term incarcerations. After being released from jail for his other offenses, Alcala killed 4 additional ladies, the youngest being 12 years of age. He was caught and sentenced to death in California. While he has been conclusively linked to 8 murders, Alcala's true number of victims remains unknown and could be much higher. Authorities believe the actual number is as high as 130. Alcala died in prison while on death row. Christopher J. Scarver Sr., murdered Jeffrey Dahmer. On June 1, 1990, Scarver shot and killed Steve Lohman during a robbery. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison and sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. 2 years later, in November of 1994, Scarver was assigned to a work detail with 2 other inmates, Jesse Anderson, serving time for the murder of his wife, and Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibalistic serial killer. When corrections officers left the 3 unsupervised, Scarver attacked Jeffrey Dahmer with a metal bar that he had removed from a piece of exercise equipment in the prison weight room. He then beat Jesse Anderson with a wooden stick at the showers. He returned to his cell and told an officer, "God told me to do it." It is believed that Scarver murdered Dahmer and Anderson, who were both white, because of Dahmer's murders of black males, and because Anderson had stabbed his wife to death and then attempted to frame 2 black males as the perpetrators of the attack. Lonnie David Franklin, Jr., the Grim Sleeper. An American serial killer who was responsible for at least 10 murders in Los Angeles, California from 1984 to 2007. Following a conviction for gang raping a 17-year-old girl in 1974, Franklin was dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Army. By 1987, there were 7 victims linked to the same gun, all of whom had been shot in the chest at close range. Franklin seemingly took a 14-year hiatus after his last known crime in 1988, and his next confirmed murder occurred in 2002. As a result of this dormancy, he was nicknamed the Grim Sleeper. Investigators have stated they believe it is likely that there were other as yet unidentified victims during that time frame. In 2010, Franklin was arrested as a suspect. After many delays, his trial began in 2016. The jury convicted him and courts sentenced him to death for each of the 10 victims. In March of 2020, Franklin was found dead in his prison cell. Medieval torture methods, the thumbscrew. The thumbscrew is a torture instrument first used in early modern Europe. It is a simple vise, sometimes with protruding studs on the interior surfaces. The crushing bars were sometimes lined with sharp metal points to puncture the nails. While the most common design operated upon a single thumb or big toe, variants could accommodate both big toes, all 5 fingers of one hand, or all 10 toes. The thumbscrew was considered one of the most notoriously effective tools used to gain a confession from the accused. One of its redeeming aspects, in the eyes of the torturers, was that it wasn't lethal at all and yet it inflicted extraordinary pain on the prisoner. Alleged heretics or blasphemers were the most common people to be subjected to this form of torture. The inquisitors first attempted to extract confessions from these prisoners before presenting them for trial and sentencing. Medieval torture methods, the breaking wheel. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, or simply the wheel, crushed the limbs and bones of prisoners. It was mostly reserved for the worst criminals that had been sentenced to death. The wheel would inflict maximum pain and suffering before eventually causing death. Those subjected to this punishment were either broken, by, or, on, the wheel. In the first, an executioner dropped a wheel on the victim to break their bones. In the second, the victim was tied to a wheel so that an executioner could break their bones with a cudgel. Afterward, the victim would often be left to die on the wheel for hours, or even days, their broken limbs gruesomely intertwined in the wheel's spokes. Since the body remained on the wheel after execution, left to scavenging animals, birds and decay, this form of punishment had a sacral function beyond death. According to the belief at that time, this would hinder transition from death to resurrection. Medieval torture methods, scaphism. Scaphism was created by the Persian Empire around 500 BCE. This ancient execution method was also known as the boats, as subjects were placed in 2 hollowed-out logs or boats with their heads and limbs sticking out. Their bodies would be trapped inside, as they would be force-fed milk and honey. Their uncontrollable diarrhea filled the boats as executioners poured honey over the prisoner's face. The boats were sent out into the middle of a stagnant body of water. Vermin arrived to not only feast upon the prisoners, but enter their bodies to fatally eat them from the inside out. This method of execution was typically used for political prisoners or those who had committed heinous crimes against the state. Death usually came from dehydration, septic shock, or gangrene. Medieval torture methods, the rack. The rack is a torture device consisting of a rectangular, usually wooden frame, with a roller at one or both ends. The victim's ankles are fastened to one roller and the wrists are chained to the other. As the interrogation progresses, a handle and ratchet mechanism attached to the top roller are used to very gradually retract the chains. slowly increasing the strain on the prisoner's shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows and causing excruciating pain. The prisoner's joints were dislocated until he either confessed or was torn apart. The rack might have been the medieval era's most brutal device. The rare few that survived it were left unable to move their arms or legs for the rest of their lives. It's unclear exactly from which civilization it originated, though some of the earliest examples are from Greece. The rack was notoriously used by the Spanish Inquisition, a Catholic organization that forced everyone in Europe and its territories to convert to Catholicism, oftentimes by extreme force. Medieval torture methods, Judas cradle. The Judas cradle was primarily used for religious purposes to gain a confession, although it was also used against political opponents. This was a wooden or metal pyramid-shaped seat, on which the subject was placed on top. Hands and legs would be tied, so the weight could not be shifted. The point of the pyramid was slowly inserted into an orifice on the victim, resulting in the subject being slowly stretched and eventually impaled by the tip of the seat. The torturers were given a stipend, and their main task was to extract information or a confession from a prisoner. The torture could continue from a few hours to days, making the damage permanent. To make the process even more painful, weights could be added to facilitate the effect, which often resulted in death by impalement. Even if the prisoner confessed early, many died of infection on account of the dried blood and feces from these filthy devices. Medieval torture methods, the heretic's fork. The heretic's fork is a bi-pronged fork attached to a belt that would be secured around the subject's neck. Should they fall asleep or allow their head to droop, the sharp prongs would dig in and pierce their chin and throat. When locked into the device, individuals would find themselves unable to eat, sleep, or even lie down. The objective was to eventually break the subject's will, so these devices were commonly inscribed with the Latin phrase, aberuo, I recant. The length of the tines on the forks were specifically designed so that even if a subject threw their head forward in an attempt to end the suffering, they would not be long enough to cause death instantly. Most, however, would not attempt that. Human instinct and the sense of self-preservation would cause most subjects to keep their heads up and back to minimize injury. This would prolong their suffering and normally result in a confession. After confessing, punishment for heresy involved being burned at the stake. Medieval torture methods, the brazen bull. The brazen bull was a hollow brass statue crafted to resemble a real bull. Prisoners were placed inside, usually with their tongues cut out first. The door was shut, sealing them in. Fires would then be lit around the bull. As the subject succumbed to the searing heat inside, he would thrash about and scream in agony. The movements and sounds, muted by the bull's mass, made the apparatus appear alive. The sounds inside were like those of a real bull. This effect created amusement for the audience, also serving the added benefit of detaching them from the brutality of the torture, since they couldn't directly see inside. Legend has it that this device was invented by Perillus of Athens for a tyrant named Phalaris of Agrigentum. Expecting a handsome reward for his creativity, Perillus instead became the first person placed inside the brazen bull. Some reports say Phalaris himself became an eventual victim of the bull when his subjects grew tired of his mistreatment. Medieval torture methods, lingqi. Lingqi was a form of torture and execution used in China from roughly 900 CE up until around the early 1900s. Translated variously as the slow process, the lingering death, or slow slicing, and also known as death by 1,000 cuts. It was also used in Vietnam and Korea. In this form of execution, a knife was used to methodically remove portions of the body over an extended period of time, eventually resulting in death. Lingqi was reserved for crimes viewed as especially heinous, such as treason. The process involved tying the condemned prisoner to a wooden frame. The flesh was then cut from the body in multiple slices in a process that was not specified in detail in Chinese law, and therefore most likely varied. The punishment worked on 3 levels: as a form of public humiliation, as a slow and lingering death, and even as a punishment after death. To be cut to pieces meant that the body of the victim would not be whole in spiritual life after death.
Junior, but you may know me as Mo3 from Dallas, Texas. You know, I was 28 at the time of death. Yeah, I was rising in the rap game, but it would start falling down. In December 2019, I was shot in the back of the head, but survived. Almost a year later, Wednesday, November 11th, 2020, I was leaving a friend's crib, but I noticed some people in the car following me, so I hit the dash and hopped on the interstate. Trying to protect myself, I stopped the car to try to get my gun, but I couldn't get it out in time, so I ran south on the highway. I was chased and shot multiple times. The police came and tried to revive me, but I died of my wounds at the scene at 11:55 a.m.
Bennett, but folks call me King Von V-Roy for grandson. I was an up-and-coming rapper from Chicago to November 6, 2020. A week after my album, Welcome to a Block, came out. Is in Atlanta hosting an album release party. A little after 2 in the morning that Friday, an altercation between me, my crew, and some other people escalated to a gunfire outside the club. I was shot 5 times. I was rushed to a nearby hospital where I died during surgery, and I was 26 years old. 3 people, including me, died that night, and another 6 were injured.
My name is Kirsten Carball, known in the music industry by my stage name Takeoff, and the youngest member of the Migos group at the age of 28 at around 2:30 a.m. November 1st, 2022. I was fatally shot at a bowling alley in Houston. While leaving the party, people began firing shots. I was shot once in the head and torso. I was pronounced dead on the spot. One thing I want people to remember is you gotta stay on your P's and Q's. When you're popping so hard, you got these blessings coming down. You got the devil trying to get at you.
Boy Scott. I was a rapper known as Jay the Youngin. My hit songs 23 Island, Animation, and more. I was 24 years old on July 27, 2022, through Wednesday evenings. Me and my pops was sitting in the front yard of the housing house in Bogalusa when a black truck pulled up and 3 people hopped out with guns. We tried running inside the house, but 2 more people with guns came from the side of the house. We were ambushed, and then shots rang out. My daddy shot back in self-defense for both of us, but I was hit at least 8 times, and my pops was shot twice too. I was taken to the hospital where I died from my injuries.